You are just a glorified worker in this company. You're fired, now get out.
But I have given 15 years of my life to this company.
That is no longer my problem. Pack your things and get out. Goodbye.
Hello? Make them all regret it.
David Ellis walked into the boardroom already knowing something was wrong. 15 years at the company. 15 years of fixing the problems nobody else could fix. And now he'd been summoned to an emergency meeting with no agenda, no warning, and no explanation. Vanessa Caldwell was already seated at the head of the table. She didn't stand, she didn't greet him. She slid a single envelope across the polished wood and said one word. Sit. David didn't sit. He opened the envelope instead. Termination. Effective immediately. No cause listed. No severance discussion. Security was already waiting by the door. 15 years, David said quietly, and I don't get a reason? You're no longer in a position to ask questions, Vanessa said. An older board member, Harold Whitmore, opened his mouth to object. Vanessa cut him off with a look before he got a word out. David noticed something strange. A thick blue folder sat on the table beside Vanessa's hand untouched, and every board member in the room kept glancing at it like it mattered more than he did. He didn't ask about the folder. He picked up the only thing on the desk that was his, a photograph of his daughter, and walked out without another word. Nobody stopped him. Everyone in that room assumed he'd just been erased. They had no idea what he was. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who likes stories where quiet people turn out to be the most dangerous person in the room, hit subscribe now, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. You're going to want to be here for the ending. To understand who David Ellis really was, you had to understand what he looked like from the outside, because the two things had nothing to do with each other. He drove a 12-year-old truck. He lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. He coached a youth basketball team on Saturdays. He'd been raising his 16-year-old daughter, Ava, alone since his wife passed away years earlier, and he never once mentioned it at work unless someone asked directly. To his coworkers, he was the reliable one, the guy who solved logistics problems in one meeting instead of 5. Steady, unremarkable. Exactly the kind of man people stopped noticing. Only Ava noticed the calls. They came at strange hours, sometimes midnight, sometimes right in the middle of dinner. Voices from overseas, voices with urgency in them, and her father would step onto the porch, speak in a low, calm tone for a few minutes, then come back inside like nothing happened. Who was that? She'd ask. Old friends, he'd say, every time, and never elaborate. Ava had stopped pushing years ago. But she'd started wondering, what kind of quiet operations manager gets calls like that? Vanessa Caldwell, meanwhile, was celebrating. She'd spent 8 months designing an acquisition, buying up a handful of struggling companies through a supply chain restructuring that was aggressive, cutting, and, crucially, not illegal. Not quite. It skirted every ethical line without technically crossing one. There was only one obstacle left: David Ellis's signature. Months earlier, David had quietly raised concerns, not about legality, but about the thousands of employees whose pensions would be gutted once the restructuring went through. He hadn't threatened to go public. He hadn't even raised his voice. He'd simply refused to sign off until the numbers made sense. Vanessa read that refusal as a threat. She believed David knew enough about the company's internal weaknesses to expose the whole plan if he stayed. So she removed the obstacle the simplest way she knew. She fired him before he could become a problem. As far as she was concerned, the deal was as good as done. She had no idea what she'd actually just done. David carried one cardboard box out of the building. He paused on the sidewalk, looked back at the glass tower once, then took out his phone and made a call. "It's me," he said. A voice answered immediately. "Mr. Ellis, you can do whatever you have to do. They fired me just now." Silence on the line, then understood. The call ended. That was it. No shouting, no threats. 2 sentences and it was over. The audience? Everyone in that boardroom, everyone at that company had no idea who was on the other end of that call or why it mattered. They were about to find out. The first cracks were small, almost invisible. a bank David's company had worked with for a decade suddenly needed additional time to finalize paperwork. A logistics partner postponed a signature that had been ready for weeks. A consulting firm David had never dealt with directly requested extra due diligence on the acquisition. Out of nowhere, an investor who'd already verbally committed asked for one more meeting. Vanessa noticed the delays but waved them off. Coincidence, she told herself. Bureaucracy. Nothing that wouldn't resolve itself in a week. She had no reason yet to connect any of it to a man she'd already forgotten. Here's what nobody at that company ever bothered to ask about David Ellis: what he did before he arrived. Years earlier, before this job, before Ava was even born, David had built a name in a world most people never see: corporate crisis recovery. When billion-dollar companies were days from collapse, the kind of collapse that makes headlines and destroys thousands of jobs overnight, they called David. Quietly, never publicly. He fixed what other people couldn't. Not through tricks, not through legal loopholes, through relationships built one hard, honest conversation at a time. CEOs who'd been ready to lose everything. Investors who'd trusted him with numbers they'd never shown anyone else. Bank chairmen. Government regulators. Suppliers on 3 different continents. He never took credit publicly. He never wanted a title bigger than the work. What he built instead was rarer than money. People who owed him their company's survival and knew it. Then his wife got sick, and David walked away from all of it. The recognition, the enormous fees, the influence, to raise his daughter with something steady instead of something impressive. He took the quiet job, the unremarkable title. And for 15 years, nobody at that company ever asked why a man with his instincts was content fixing supply routes instead of running boardrooms. They mistook quiet for ordinary. That night, David came home carrying the box. Ava saw it before he said a word. "Did they finally do it?" she asked. He nodded. She expected him to be angry. Instead, he sat down heavy at the kitchen table, and the first thing out of his mouth wasn't about himself. "I told you I'd help with college," he said. "I don't know how I do that now." Ava crossed the kitchen and hugged him. "People can take your position," she said, repeating something he'd told her years ago, back when she was too young to understand it. "They can't take your character." David didn't say anything back. He didn't have to. That was the moment the story stopped being about a company. It became about a father who just lost his income and a daughter who still believed in him more than he believed in himself right then. 3 days later, Harold Whitmore showed up at David's front door. He was the board member who'd tried to speak during the firing. He looked older standing on David's porch than he had in that boardroom, smaller, almost ashamed. "I owe you an apology," Harold said. "And an explanation." David let him in. Harold told him the truth. Vanessa hadn't fired David for performance. She'd fired him because his signature was the one internal approval she couldn't manipulate, couldn't pressure, couldn't rush. David had become, without ever meaning to, the last ethical checkpoint standing between Vanessa and a deal she needed pushed through fast. Then Harold handed him a document. David read it in silence. It wasn't just an aggressive restructuring. Buried inside the acquisition plan was a set of risks the company had deliberately kept off the books. Nothing illegal enough to call fraud outright, but concealed carefully enough that shareholders and thousands of employees with retirement accounts tied to the company had no idea what they were actually exposed to. David sat with that for a long moment. This had stopped being about him getting fired. It was about protecting people who didn't even know they needed protecting. If you're watching and enjoying the story, drop a comment and let me know. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps. Now let's see what David does with what he just found out. David didn't sue. He didn't go to the press. He didn't post anything online. He made phone calls. Not many, just a few. Each one to someone who'd owed him something for a long time. Not money, never money. Respect. One call went to a bank chairman whose institution David had quietly saved from collapse a decade earlier. One went to a man who'd walked through bankruptcy and come out the other side because David refused to give up on him. One went to a woman who was now a billionaire because David had rescued a merger everyone else had already declared dead. None of them owed him a favor on paper. All of them remembered exactly what he'd done for them. This was the thing Vanessa never understood about David Ellis. He'd never had power in the way she measured it. He had something slower to build and far harder to take away. Credibility. Within 2 weeks, everything Vanessa had built started coming apart at once. The bank paused financing, citing internal review. Institutional investors quietly suspended their commitments. The legal team advising the acquisition withdrew without public comment. Auditors demanded an emergency review of the restructuring numbers. One supplier walked away without explanation. Then another. Nobody accused the company of anything publicly. Nobody had to. They simply stopped trusting it, one relationship at a time, until there was nothing solid left to stand on. Vanessa couldn't understand it. She hadn't broken any law. She hadn't done anything that would show up in a headline. But she'd fired the one man whose name, when spoken, made people believe a deal was safe. And now that his name was gone from the deal, so was everyone's confidence in it. Here's the twist, and it's simpler than anyone expected. David never told anyone to destroy the company. He never asked for revenge. That first phone call, "They fired me just now," wasn't an order. It was information. The people he called made their own decision after hearing it. They decided, independently, that they weren't willing to keep backing a company that would discard its most trusted person without a reason. David didn't burn the company down. Vanessa built something that couldn't survive the truth being known. He just made sure the truth was known. Vanessa finally showed up at David's office, the one he no longer had, and found him at a coffee shop near his house instead. "What did you do?" she demanded. "I told the truth," David said, "to people who know my character. You ruined everything." David looked at her, calm, no satisfaction in his face at all. "No," he said, "you built something that couldn't survive the truth." She had nothing left to say to that. The board removed Vanessa within the month. Investigations confirmed the concealed risks Harold had shown David, and the acquisition was stopped before a single pension was touched. The board offered David the CEO position. He turned it down. Instead, he recommended someone he trusted to run daily operations, and agreed only to stay on as an outside advisor. Enough involvement to protect what mattered, not enough to take over his life again. He chose his daughter over the corner office. It wasn't a hard choice. Months later, David and Ava sat on the porch together, the way they did most evenings now. "Do you ever regret making that phone call?" she asked. David smiled. "It wasn't the phone call that changed anything," he said. "It was spending a lifetime becoming someone with high friend and worth answering." If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments the biggest lesson you're taking from David's story. Titles can open doors, but character is what keeps them open. Wealth can buy influence, but integrity is what earns loyalty. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one giving the orders. It's the one whose name is still spoken with trust long after they've already walked away.